This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. We have found roads crossing in both these pro-democracy series of essays and our newer Problem with the Media series of insights. Ones that are so crucial that we really think it needs to be reoccurringly said across all of our work on a semi-regular basis, that when talking about self-development, that is focused on the self, which is the individual. While we are each certainly infinite fractals of consciousness, both whole and part of the whole, and the little ego of your physical self on the chessboard of the material world does have its place, we must also look at the structuring of the whole chessboard of society and where the self fits in within the larger map. And a simple summary of that structuring in terms of freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the most free from empire, which will be the subject of our next series, is all about how hierarchy is structured and distributed in terms of money, societal class status, or oftentimes historically called caste status. And as said before, and we'll just keep saying it, it's the one that most benefits and continues to create an informed and educated middle class, and thus an informed and educated voting electorate, as well as the poor to hopefully become part of that middle class. It's so incredibly about that we could call all of our essays and insights that touch on the societal and the political the hierarchy files. And that's one of the reasons we create these audio outputs, to help our fellow middle class become more informed and educated about both self-development and societal improvement. The United States is a great country, but if we are honest and not dark agents, we must admit that it's also a militarized empire built on sociopathic and psychopathic settler colonialism and genocide on the backs of slaves, and is still a long way to go for making up for that. Even into modern times, spending the last century fueling coups in South America, getting into quagmire near endless stupid occupations in Muslim countries in the Middle East for oil and minerals, and still very much continuing to this day by giving money to the monsters of the Israeli Offense Force to genocide Palestinians. Empire is all about commodifying the elements of earth, air, fire, and water through usually religious holy wars via colonialism, essentially making money off what should not have been made money off of. Capital mixed with social, capitalism and socialism, are the two best systems when intertwined and working in balance together. An element of capital is the ownership of property, while societal is more for the public good, and there's a saying that says conservatives care more about property while liberals care more about people. This is why extreme regressive reactionaries short-circuit at the sound of the word socialism when used with democracy, because they don't care about other people, and democratic socialism uses the government to enact policies that help the middle class instead of just the ultra-wealthy, God forbid. The main downside of socialism without private capitalism is it starts turning into communism. The major downside of capitalism without any socialism is it assumes and requires a planet of infinite material resources to commodify, and also that it heavily stratifies and amplifies caste status. A societal class or social stratum is the grouping of people into a set of hierarchical social categories. Class status or class-based society is an organizing principle society in which ownership of property, the means of production, and wealth is the determining factor of the distribution of power, in which those with more property and wealth are stratified higher in the society, and those without access to the means of production and without wealth are stratified lower in society. When psychopathic settler colonialism came to the New World of America in the late 1400s, it was discovered that the Native Americans had no concept of private property and were unbribable, because they had not yet had those aspects of the imperial operating system installed. In an imperial-influenced class society, which is pretty much the whole world now outside of indigenous peoples, it divides and separates its citizens, at least implicitly, into distinct social strata, commonly referred to as societal class or castes. Historically, in the Dark Ages of the West, this was a hierarchy of gods, then monarchs or royalty, which were said through old-school lies to also have divine rights, then aristocracy, then clergy, then nobility or gentry, then the dirt poor consisting of laborers or servants or beggars. The modernized version of this is broken out into the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class, with membership of societal class dependent upon pre-existing wealth, education, occupation, income, and of course family lineage. Regressive boogeyman Karl Marx, who identified problems with capitalism fairly well but then proposed not very good solutions, defined class by, again, one's relationship to the means of production. Classes in modern social mixed with capital society are that the proletariat work but do not own the means of production, and the bourgeoisie, those who invest and live off the surplus generated by the proletariat's operation of the means of production, do not need to work at all technically. A caste is a fixed societal group in which an individual is born within a particular system of social stratification, a caste system. Within such a system, individuals are expected to marry exclusively within the same caste, follow lifestyles often linked to a particular occupation, hold ritual status observed within the hierarchy, and interact with others based on cultural notions of exclusion, with certain castes considered as either more pure or more polluted than others. This is commonly seen in America within how the children of Indian immigrants are expected to marry, which, like in India, is very conservative and class-based. Because Hinduism expects Hindus not only to marry other Hindus, but also ones at their similar or higher socioeconomic status, the American Indian girl from a Hindu family who is in medical school is set up in a more or less arranged marriage, even in the 2020s, not the 1220s, with the Indian boy who is in law school, so the Indian doctor can marry an Indian lawyer. This is why most, if not all, Indians you know have married another Indian, and why one marrying another is the norm, not the exception. And that brown Indian girl would certainly get tons of pressure from her family if she wanted to marry a black or white public school teacher. And we can say this as someone who did not marry within our race and did not have parents who said, "You must marry a white girl whose family is more rich than ours." This is also no more transparently seen in modernity than within the justice system, which we'll be getting into soon along with voting in this series, which is really a two-tiered justice system, one that typically functions well for the wealthy and powerful, bourgeoisie, and large corporations who can afford armies of lawyers, versus the poor, often amplified by over-policing of poor African Americans who must use public defenders, or lawsuits by the ultra-rich which are designed to drain the coffers of anyone who isn't wealthy. John Grisham's 1995 novel, The Rainmaker, is about a young new lawyer who just passed the bar exam who takes on essentially his first case, and it's the case of a lifetime, against a large corrupt insurance company, which is revealed during the trial that its internal company policy has been to blanketly deny all claims initially, playing the odds that the insured would not consult an attorney. The case is eventually more or less won by the new lawyer, who sits only with his other legal helper, who hasn't been able to pass the bar exam, across from the boardroom table from about half a dozen soulless, long-sold-out corporate lawyers. The young guy is fighting for the small individual, lower in caste and socioeconomic status, versus the corporate lawyers who fight on behalf of the large company, made up of ultra-rich criminals who have higher socioeconomic status. At the time of this writing, the Supreme Court is structured extremely conservative, regressive, reactionary, and the simple cheat code with them throughout nearly all the cases they have taken up has been that the corporation wins every time, and the little guy, the single member of the lower to upper middle class, gets screwed. The long con attack on the American middle class has been by design to regress wealth and income inequality and continue to amplify class separation status back towards how it was in the Dark Ages, thus hurting the self-development of each individual because every day becomes just about not starving to death. As a result, American tax policy, and its knock-on effects across all of society, has been worse than any other developed country in the world in our lifetime. And the well-documented result has catalyzed a wide variety of societal ills. This rupturing of much of working Americans' economic and political power has not just produced anxiety and often sadly despair, it's also caused far too many Americans in the past to disengage from politics because they view the political system as hopelessly corrupt and only beholden to the godzillionaires and corporations that made them rich. Since your giant conspirituality realization should simply be that because power corrupts, and at this point in the timeline we simply have a bunch of greed from crooks at the top of the hierarchy, We are constantly boggled by those in the conspiracy world, or those who claim to be on the spiritual path even, who fall down into traps of cults or nested cults based on the religions of empire, or simply just become more regressive and reactionary in their politics, which just end up helping the ultra-rich and hurting the middle class, which they themselves are likely in, or often even on the poverty line if they've struggled having a set career path. Thus, the point is they're only hurting themselves. But we also know this is an imperial tactic in the war for your development and mind, because the more amplified the wealth inequality, the more it severely damages democracy and paves the way for potential totalitarian rule. In 2016, Roberto Stefan Fior and Rashinda Munk published a paper in the Journal of Democracy showing how, in the era since trickle-down, or otherwise called golden shower, nightmare neoliberal for the rich, meaning extreme freedom for the rich, economy of the 1980s, many Americans within nested cults that lean conservative, meaning mainly valuing caste status above their own, have devalued democracy. In the United States, and even among all voting ages, the share of citizens who believe that it would be better to have a strong leader who does not have to bother with the parliament or elections has also risen over time. In 1995, apparently 24% of respondents held this view, but by 2011, apparently that figure had increased to 32%. By the time the paper came out in 2016, almost 49% of Americans thought elites should be making more decisions rather than government, and that growing disillusionment with democracy is them being played like fiddles, pushed toward solutions hatched by the dark agents of the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. If we want to continue recovering democracy, one major simple thing entails bringing back sensible tax policy, like we had for over 40 years from post-Great Depression to the 1980s. Pushing both the top real estate and top income tax marginal rates back up above 50%, to help end cutthroat capitalism for the poor and middle class and socialism for the rich. But the empire doesn't like that.